Megan was undercover on a classified mission, planted inside Jacob's team as just a sniper, but her true objective was to expose the corruption that led straight to him. From the moment she arrived, Jacob humiliated her. Cold remarks, mocking smiles, subtle attacks meant to remind her she didn't belong. He believed she was weak. He believed she was replaceable. He never imagined she was building a case against him. With every insult, her silence grew heavier, her determination sharper. In the Appalachian Mountains, everything collided. Megan located a secret red box, final proof of Jacob's betrayal. But Jacob had been following her. Suspicion turned into confrontation. When he reached for the box, her warning was calm and deadly. Touch it and you die. He laughed and grabbed it anyway. The gunshot shattered the silence of the mountains. Jacob fell, clutching his shattered foot, disbelief written across his face. Megan didn't hesitate. She opened the box, only to realize the contents didn't just expose corruption, they threatened to collapse the entire mission. And what waited beyond that discovery would change everything. Before we uncover how this story truly began, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to the start.
The Appalachian rain fell in a cold, needling sheet that flattened the canopy and turned the forest floor into a slurry of decomposing leaves and red clay. Water traced slow paths down bark and webbed across the slick roots of an ancient oak that had rotted from the inside out. Megan Steele knelt beside what remained of its trunk, her right knee grounded, left foot planted for balance. Rifle indexed along her thigh at a disciplined low ready. Camouflage's grease broke the symmetry of her face. Black and green cut the planes of her cheekbones and dulled the shine of skin. Rain collected at the edge of her jaw and dropped without her noticing. In the hollow of the stump sat a pelican-style case, bright red. Polymer shell unmarred except for shallow abrasions near the latches. The color was wrong for this terrain, an intrusion against moss and loam. She studied it without touching it, cataloging details the way she would any object in a target area, hinge integrity. Gasket line, weight distribution by the way it settled into the wood pulp. No visible tamper seals. No trip filament in the immediate brush. Her breathing stayed metronomic 4, count in through the nose, 6 count out through parted lips. Her pulse held steady, a quiet thud in her ears that did not accelerate, despite the surge of codecalamines she could feel warming her fingertips. Behind her, a branch displaced water with a muted snap. The cadence of steps that followed carried more mass than necessary. Commander Jacob Thompson emerged from the tree line with shoulders squared and chin lifted, boots sinking deep enough to pull at suction with each stride. He did not scan his sectors before closing distance. His weapon road-slung but unsecured at the low ready, muzzle drifting across the tree line without discipline. Rain beaded on the brim of his patrol cap and ran in rivulets over a jaw set hard enough to pulse at the hinge. "Step aside, Steele." His voice was low, the consonants clipped. The muscle beneath his left eye flickered once and went still. That's sensitive intel. Above your pay grade. She did not stand. The movement she made was minimal weight shifting through her hips, the stock of her rifle settling into the pocket of her shoulder without a sound. The barrel aligned not at him, but at the ground between them, a geometry that left no ambiguity about the next inch of travel. Her trigger finger rested indexed along the receiver, straight and patient. When she spoke, her tone carried no rise or tremor. "Touch it, and you die, Commander." The rain softened around them as if absorbed by the mud. Thompson's mouth curved at one corner. The smirk did not reach his eyes. He looked at her rank tab, then at the red case, then back to her face, lingering a fraction too long as if expecting to find hesitation there. His gloved hand flexed once, leather creasing over the knuckles. He exhaled through his nose, a short sound that might have been a laugh. "You haven't got the nerve." He stepped forward, boot heel grinding into the mud with a wet suction. his right hand extended toward the molded handle. Megan's cheek welded to the comb of the stock, her sight picture stabilized through rain distortion. She compensated for drop over negligible distance out of habit, not necessity. The pad of her finger took up slack, found the wall, and broke the shot clean. The suppressed report was a tight crack swallowed by the trees. A 5.56 millimeters round struck through the leather and bone of Thompson's boot, shattering metatarsals and exiting into the mud. The impact folded him at the waist. His breath left in a guttural rush as he collapsed, hands clawing at his foot. Mud splashed across his sleeve. The rifle slipped from his grasp and landed half-submerged, muzzle fouled. Megan held the sight picture a fraction longer, assessing. No secondary movement. No additional signatures in her periphery. She rose in one controlled motion, sling tightening across her chest as she transitioned to her sidearm. She closed the distance, towing his weapon out of reach with a measured nudge. His face had drained of color. Rain mingled with sweat along his brow. His jaw tremored once before clamping shut against the pain. She did not look at the blood pooling into the clay. Her focus stayed clinical, detached. The red case remained in the stump, latches unbroken, rain tapping against its shell. The forest resumed its rhythm around them, indifferent. 6 weeks earlier, the tone had been set the moment Megan Steele stepped through the security gate and onto the installation. The morning air carried the sterile scent of wet concrete and jet fuel. A sentry checked her credentials without expression, eyes moving from her face to the laminated ID and back again. The name read, Petty Officer Steele. Her service record, as presented in the system, was efficient and unremarkable, marksman qualified, prior deployments summarized in neutral language. Several commendations listed without detail. Naval intelligence had done its work with precision. Entire segments of her operational history had been excised under classification authority, replaced with blank efficiency. She walked across the compound with a sea bag's worth of gear slung over her shoulder, posture aligned, gaze level. The men who glanced her way registered her presence in brief, appraising looks, boots, haircut, posture, rifle case. She gave them nothing back, no challenge, no attempt at rapport. Her face remained composed, features settled into a professional stillness that revealed neither pride nor apology. Inside the team room, Commander Jacob Thompson stood at the head of a long table scarred by years of use. A topographic map was spread flat, grease pencils and range cards scattered along its edges. When Megan entered, conversation dimmed by a fraction. Thompson's eyes moved over her uniform, paused at her trident, then at her rank, insignia petty officer. His mouth tightened almost imperceptibly before he gestured toward an empty seat. "You're attached for the recon drill," he said, voice clipped. "You'll integrate and follow the plan." She nodded once. "Aye, sir." The first interruption came before she had finished her initial terrain assessment. She traced a ridgeline on the map with the blunt end of a pencil, indicating likely observation points and avenues of approach. Her language was precise: grid references, contour intervals, probable dead space along the eastern slope. Thompson leaned forward, palm flattening against the table, and began speaking over her, volume increasing by degrees. He dismissed her elevation estimates with a short, dismissive breath through his nose. He circled an alternate route in thick strokes, the grease pencil pressing hard enough to tear the paper. "That's not how we're running it," he said. The tendon along his neck stood out sharply. "We move direct." Her hand withdrew from the map. She folded it loosely at the wrist and rested it against her thigh. "Understood." During the rucks, he assigned her the PRC-152 and additional batteries, stacking weight into her pack until the straps cut into the trapezius. The load exceeded what her designated role required. She adjusted the shoulder harness without comment, tightened the sternum strap, and stepped off with the formation. Mud sucked at their boots. Humidity pressed against their lungs. Her breathing remained even, Sweat ran along her spine and disappeared into fabric. Thompson glanced back more than once, watching for a stumble that did not come. On the range, he corrected her grip with exaggerated impatience, fingers hovering near her hands without touching. "Loosen up," he said, as if instructing a novice. "You're muscling it." She shifted her support hand by millimeters, not because she needed to, but because the exercise required compliance. Her trigger press remained clean, recoil managed, sight picture reacquired without wasted motion. The tight grouping on paper spoke in quiet rebuttal. Thompson's jaw flexed. He ordered a transition drill immediately after, pushing tempo without reset. She flowed through it with the economy of someone who had done it thousands of times, then stepped back into line. The remarks grew sharper in private moments. A comment about kitchens delivered under his breath during a field exercise. A question about whether she understood the difference between observation and imagination. Each barb was placed carefully, designed to elicit reaction. She offered none. Her eyes stayed forward. The only visible change was a fractional stillness in her shoulders, as if she had anchored herself against an internal current. At night, the barracks settled into the low chorus of sleeping, men-measured breaths, the occasional turn of a caught spring. Megan sat on the edge of her bunk beneath dim light, a ruggedized laptop open across her knees. She inserted an encrypted drive, fingers moving across the keyboard with deliberate speed. Audio files transferred through secure channels to a handler whose name did not appear on any roster. Her voice in the recordings was steady, stripped of inflection as she logged incidents, deviations from procurement protocol. Unexplained expenditures flagged against training budgets. Meetings conducted without required documentation. Dates, times, witnesses. She cited applicable sections of the Uniform Code of Military Justice without emphasis. When she closed the laptop, she remained seated for a moment, hands resting on her thighs. The humiliation of the day registered only in the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. The investigation extended beyond personal grievance. The scope reached upward budgetary irregularities, contractor influence, command responsibility. The evidence she had was substantial, but not yet decisive. Testimony without material corroboration would fracture under scrutiny. She needed something tangible, something that could not be redacted. The operation order listed it as a survival and evasion exercise, Phase 3 validation under austere conditions. Grid coordinates, time hacks, contingency frequencies, everything formatted to resemble doctrine. On paper, it was routine. In execution, it bent around Commander Thompson's private objective. The Appalachian terrain did not forgive error. Slopes rose at punishing angles, forcing the team into switchbacks that shredded calves and stole breath. The canopy knitted overhead so tightly that GPS reception degraded into intermittent static. Compasses became primary. Pace counts replaced digital certainty. Moisture clung to uniforms and weapon systems alike, seeping into seams, testing maintenance discipline. Thompson drove them forward without pause. He set a tempo that exceeded the mission profile, shaving rest cycles down to seconds measured on his wristwatch. Hydration halts were truncated. No formal checks for hot spots or strap abrasions. He waved off a request to confirm azimuth after a deviation around a rock slide, jaw tightening as he spoke. Maintain interval. We're burning daylight. Megan moved within the formation with measured efficiency, rifle secured across her chest, ruck riding high against her scapulae. The additional weight he had assigned her during workups remained part of her load outcomes gear stacked above what her billet required. The straps pressed into muscle already fatigued from elevation gain. She adjusted once, tightening the waist belt to redistribute weight to her hips. Her face showed nothing beyond the neutral focus of a professional undertask. The intel they pursued had been packaged as a training objective. Recover a simulated cache at a designated drop point to test navigation under degraded systems. The coordinates had circulated through official channels. What had not circulated was the contractor's involvement, nor the pattern of financial irregularities she had traced in parallel. The cache was not simulated. It was a ledger of illicit payments, routed through shell entities and disguised as training allocations. Physical proof. Thompson's urgency betrayed more than ambition. It carried the tight, controlled edge of a man racing a clock only he could hear. Midway up a narrow incline choked with rhododendron, Megan's stride shortened, her gaze fixed on a glint half-buried beneath wet leaves. She raised a closed fist, the standard signal to halt. The element slowed by reflex, boots grinding softly into mud. She stepped off the trail, crouching to clear debris with 2 fingers. A filament, nearly invisible, ran taut between 2 saplings at ankle height. Improvised, not part of any approved training scenario. Her shoulders remained level as she traced its direction with her eyes. "Possible tripwire," she said, voice even. Thompson did not break stride. He brushed past her, boot heels striking the ground inches from her hand. Dirt and leaf litter sprayed across her sleeve and cheek. The filament snapped harmlessly against his shin and fell slack. Whatever it had been connected to failed to trigger. "Stop seeing ghosts, Steele," he barked, not turning. "If you can't hack the hike, maybe you should have stayed in the kitchen." The words hung in the humid air. No one answered. The men behind her shifted weight from foot to foot, eyes tracking the ground instead of her face. A jaw clenched. A hand tightened briefly on a sling. No one spoke. The chain of command functioned as designed orders flowed downward. Silence flowed upward. Megan wiped the dirt from her cheek with the back of her glove. The motion was small, controlled. Her eyes followed the pulse in Thompson's neck as he continued uphill, the vein at his temple beating in a steady rhythm. She reached into her chest pocket and withdrew her dope card, the laminated rectangle worn at the edges. She did not need wind data. There was no shot to calculate. Her thumb traced the columns, distance, elevation, windage until her breathing synchronized again with the numbers. 4 in, 6 out. The cold knot low in her abdomen tightened, then settled. She resecured the card and resumed movement, boots finding purchase where others slipped. The incline steepened. The canopy thickened until daylight filtered through in narrow shafts. Sweat stung at the corners of her eyes. She blinked it away and kept her spacing consistent. 3 clicks north lay the designated drop point. She had confirmed it independently against terrain association and dead reckoning when satellite coverage failed. The ridgeline there narrowed into a shallow saddle, natural concealment on 3 sides. If the contractor had panicked, as her source suggested, it was the logical emergency rendezvous. Thompson increased pace again as they closed distance, breath audible now with exertion. He checked his watch more frequently. His hand hovered near his radio, then withdrew. The urgency radiated in small tells, the flecks of fingers, the sharp set of his shoulders when a man stumbled and recovered. Megan kept count in her head. Step, step, step. Each footfall marked downrange not just in meters, but in consequences. The exercise had ceased to be about validation or navigation. It had narrowed to a single objective, reached the drop point before Thompson could alter the narrative. The forest pressed close around them, damp and indifferent. She knew exactly where the trail would bend, exactly where the saddle would open. 3 clicks north. That was where it would end. Megan requested permission to establish an outer perimeter under the pretext of overwatch. Her tone remained procedural, consistent with the operation's order. Thompson granted it with a dismissive tilt of his head, already focused upslope. She peeled off from the element without haste, adjusting her heading by degrees until the terrain swallowed her silhouette. The ghillie suit moved with her, strands of jute and vegetation woven into its mesh-absorbing color and contour from the forest. She kept her center of gravity low, knees flexed to distribute weight silently across wet loam. Each step was deliberate, heel avoided, toe placement tested before commitment. Branches were guided aside rather than snapped. Her rifle remained indexed along her forearm, optic capped until she needed it. She left no visible spore beyond what the rain would erase. She was not establishing security. She was moving toward the emergency rendezvous point her source had identified. Unregistered contingency site selected for discretion. The contractor had panicked. Funds misdirected under falsified procurement codes had drawn scrutiny. When pressure tightened, they had chosen to preserve leverage. Physical records, hard drives, a ledger that could not be explained away in a quarterly audit. The forest thinned into a shallow clearing bordered by second-growth saplings. The air shifted, pressure dropping ahead of an approaching front. Ozone threaded through the damp. Megan halted at the tree line and let her breathing settle. She unslung the rifle and brought the thermal optic to her eye, sweeping in slow arcs. White-hot signatures would betray concealed personnel against the cooling earth. She scanned left to right, high to low, pausing at irregular shapes to confirm bark rather than fabric. The display showed only residual heat from the ground, and her own muted outline reflected in the optics. Edge. Clear. She advanced to the center of the clearing, where an ancient oak had collapsed into itself years earlier, trunk hollowed by rot. The stump remained, a dark ring against lighter soil. Water pooled within its cavity. Nestled inside, incongruous and precise, sat the case. Red polymer, pelican-style construction, latches intact. No visible scuffs beyond transport abrasion. She crouched, knees widening slightly for balance, and allowed her gaze to trace the perimeter before committing to contact. No pressure plates. No secondary devices visible at the hinge line. She listened. Wind in leaves, distant drip of water from branch to branch, the faint hiss of rain beginning again at elevation. Her gloved hand extended. The pads of her fingers brushed the surface, cold plastic under damp fabric. A twig fractured behind her. The sound carried cadence. Not the erratic scuttle of wildlife, but a measured displacement of weight pause, transfer, advance. Bipedal, adult. She did not startle. The rifle pivoted with her torso in a controlled arc, muzzle tracking toward the origin of the noise as she rose from the crouch. Her cheek found the stock without conscious thought. Safety disengaged under her thumb with a muted click. Commander Jacob Thompson stepped from the tree line, foliage parting against his shoulders. His weapon rode at the low ready, barrel angled downward but not index safe. His trigger finger hovered closer to the guard than regulation preferred. Rain stippled his sleeves. Mud streaked the lower half of his trousers from the ascent. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, the distance between them measured in meters and decisions. He had followed her, not because he suspected a perimeter gap, but because suspicion had shifted inward. The contractor's silence, the urgency of the coordinates, her quiet competence. Paranoia had sharpened his attention into a private reconnaissance. His eyes fixed on the red case, then lifted to her face. The muscle beneath his left eye twitched once. His jaws set, teeth pressing against each other hard enough to change the line of his cheek. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, knuckles whitening beneath wet gloves. "You're off your assigned sector," he said. The words were controlled, but his breathing sat higher in his chest than it had on the climb. She did not lower her weapon. Perimeter established, she replied evenly. Area clear. His gaze flicked to the thermal optic mounted along her rail, then back to the case. Calculation moved across his expression in increments. The clearing felt smaller, air heavier as the first drops of the storm reached the ground between them. He stepped forward once, boots compressing soaked leaves. The muzzle of his rifle dipped further, but the selector remained unchanged. He was close enough now to see the faint smear of camouflage across her cheek, the steadiness in her eyes. Not defiance, not hesitation, assessment. In that space, the exercise ceased to resemble training parameters. The operations order no longer defined the boundaries. The objective had narrowed to the red case resting between them and to what it contained. The mission had shifted. The 5.56mm round entered through leather and exited through bone. Jacob Thompson's right foot absorbed the impact before his mind could register the sound. The projectile shattered the metatarsals, fragmented through soft tissue, and buried itself in the mud beneath him. His body folded without command authority to steady it. He dropped hard onto his side, a raw sound tearing from his throat, stripped of rank and posture. His rifle slipped from his grip and struck the ground with a dull thud, muzzle packing with wet soil. Both hands clamped around his boot as if pressure alone could reverse physics. Blood welled dark against the rain-slick leather, then thinned and streamed into the clay. His breath came in short, involuntary bursts, sharp inhalations that failed to fill his lungs. The tendons in his neck stood out as he tried to force air past clenched teeth. He looked up at her. There was no comprehension in his expression at first, only shock. His pupils were wide, searching her face for hesitation that wasn't there. The word he had used for her, the assumptions layered over 6 weeks of contempt, fractured silently behind his eyes. His jaw trembled once before locking. Rain tracked across his forehead and into his lashes, and he did not blink. Megan held her sight picture a fraction longer, confirming incapacitation. No attempt to re-engage. No secondary threat in peripheral sectors. Her rifle came off target and slid into its sling in one fluid motion. Her sidearm cleared leather with practiced economy, muzzle aligned downward toward him as she closed distance. She used the toe of her boot to push his rifle beyond reach, sending it skidding several feet across the mud. Only then did she holster and drop to a knee beside him. "Sit, Trip," she said. Her voice carried command authority, now unfiltered, unmasked. The petty officer cadence was gone. What remained was measured and unyielding. He tried to answer, but the attempt dissolved into a strained exhale. His fingers tightened around his boot, smearing blood across his gloves. The smell of iron rose through the rain. She reached for her IFAK without hesitation, fingers locating the pull tab by memory. The pouch opened. Tourniquet. She tore it free, sliding it high above the injury, positioning it proximal to the joint. Her hands were steady, movements precise. She threaded the strap, pulled until resistance met muscle, then twisted the windlass. He arched as pressure increased. A broken groan forced its way past clenched teeth. The windlass turned again and again. She watched the bleeding rather than his face. When the flow slowed to a controlled seep, she secured the rod and checked distal perfusion by sight alone. The rain diluted what remained. "You're done, Thompson," she said evenly, glancing at her watch to mark time of application. "Assaulting a superior officer is the least of your problems." The words landed without volume, heavier than any shout. He stared at her, breath ragged. The anger that had once animated him flickered weakly beneath pain and something closer to fear. His mouth opened as if to argue, then closed. The tremor in his hands betrayed him more than any admission could. She rose without further comment and turned back to the stump. The red case remained where it had been, surface slick beneath a thin layer of rain. She crouched again, scanning its perimeter for tampering now that the dynamic had shifted. No visible changes, no audible ticking, no disturbance in the soil beyond their own. She released the first latch. It snapped open with a sharp mechanical click. The second followed. In her mind, she cataloged what should have been inside. Paper ledgers, bank routing numbers, hard drives labeled with contractor insignia, physical proof capable of surviving cross-examination and forensic audit. She lifted the lid. Inside lay a single dossier, centered with deliberate precision. Beside it, a satellite phone rested in a molded compartment. Its screen glowed faintly against the gray light of the clearing. Connection lost. The words blinked in steady intervals. For a moment, she did not move. Rain tapped against the case lid and ran along its edges. Behind her, Thompson shifted weakly in the mud, breath unsteady, tourniquet biting deep into muscle. This was not a ledger drop. Her gloved fingers hovered above the dossier before lifting it free. The paper inside was dry, protected by the seal of the case. The satellite phone continued its silent pulse, searching for a signal that was no longer there. The clearing felt different, now smaller, closer. Megan lifted the dossier from the red box with steady hands. The plastic still felt cold against her palm despite the humidity pressing in before the storm. She opened it without ceremony. The first page stopped her movement for half a second. A surveillance photograph. Her. The angle was elevated, likely long lens, compressed background. She recognized the range complex and the blurred perimeter behind her. The time stamp in the corner was precise, down to the second. Beneath the image, in bold block letters, a stamp bled through the paper fibers. Operation Clean Sweep. Her jaw tightened. A muscle in her cheek flickered once before going still. Her eyes moved line by line, absorbing the language operational directives, asset classification, containment protocol. This was not an accounting ledger. There were no routing numbers, no shell corporations mapped in careful columns. The terminology was contractual, sterile, liability mitigation, exposure threshold, asset termination authorization. Jacob shifted in the mud, breath stuttering through clenched teeth. The tourniquet had slowed the hemorrhage. Dark blood soaked into the earth beneath his calf but no longer pulsed. His fingers trembled around the fabric of his ruined boot. He watched her face as she read, searching for something he could interpret, anger, confusion, anything that might return control to him. She turned the page. His name appeared in bold type, followed by a designation, compromised intermediary, below it. A paragraph outlining financial irregularities, internal audits, a pattern of unauthorized leverage. The contractor had not been panicking. They had been documenting. Another page. Her name. Investigative threat escalating. Her breathing slowed instead of quickened. The air pressure dipped further, a low roll of thunder traveling across the tree line. She flipped to the final section. Technical specifications. Embedded transponder. Passive activation upon latch release. Satellite uplink handshake. Coordinates transmitted upon breach of seal. The red box. Not a drop. A beacon. Her gaze shifted to the case resting open beside her knee. The satellite phone inside blinked a cold message across its narrow display. Connection lost. The battery indicator remained steady. It had already done what it was designed to do. She exhaled once through her nose and closed the dossier. No wasted movement. No visible reaction beyond the slight narrowing of her eyes. Jacob swallowed hard. "What is it?" His voice rasped, stripped of its earlier command tone. Sweat ran down from his hairline, collecting at his jaw before dropping into the mud. His pupils were dilated, shock and adrenaline fighting for dominance. She tossed the stack of papers onto his chest. The impact forced a grunt from him. He fumbled with shaking hands, smearing dirt across the header as he pulled the top page into view. Terminate all assets. The words seemed to drain what little color remained in his face. His lips parted, but no sound came for a moment. A tick pulsed beneath his left eye. He read faster, breath hitching when he reached the section describing the cleanup protocol external contractors. Plausible deniability, training mishap narrative pre-drafted for release. "They set me up," he whispered, the arrogance gone. replaced by something brittle. His grip tightened on the paper until it crumpled at the edges. They used me. Megan didn't respond immediately. She scanned the tree line through her thermal optic again, methodical, disciplined. No signatures yet. That meant nothing. A professional team would approach cold, minimizing electronic footprint, spacing their movement to avoid clustering on infrared. Jacob looked at her, eyes wide now, not with disbelief, but with dawning comprehension. "We're not walking out of here, are we?" The question hung between them, heavy and unnecessary. She closed the lid of the red box with deliberate pressure until the latches clicked back into place. The sound was small, final. The storm wind moved through the canopy, bending branches, carrying the metallic scent of rain. Her mind worked through timelines. Satellite ping to tasking cell. Response window. Distance to nearest insertion point. She checked her watch again, committing the seconds to memory. Every action from this point forward would be measured. Jacob's breathing grew uneven. The pain in his foot radiated upward in waves, his body trembling as the tourniquet bit into muscle and vessel. His earlier paranoia had dissolved into raw fear. He searched her face again, looking for reassurance, for leadership he had tried to undermine. She met his gaze at last. There was no softness in it, but there was clarity. "Their cleaning house," she said, voice level, stripped of rank pretense and stripped of doubt. "You were expendable. So was I." Another rumble of thunder rolled overhead, closer now. The first drops of rain struck the leaves, soft at first, then steadier. The mud around Jacob darkened further, swallowing the blood into a uniform stain. He let his head fall back against the ground, staring up at the bruised sky through the canopy break. His chest rose and fell in shallow pulls. The realization settled into him fully. The contractor hadn't lost control of the situation. They had engineered it. Megan adjusted the sling on her rifle and secured the dossier inside her kit. The red box remained where it was, inert but no longer harmless. Her posture shifted subtly, weight balanced on the balls of her feet, listening past the rain, past Jacob's labored breathing, for anything out of pattern. The mission had changed. She did not say it aloud. She didn't need to. The answer came in the form of a supersonic crack that split the air above Megan's head. A high-velocity round sheared through the upper trunk of the oak, detonating bark and splinters into a violent spray. The report arrived a fraction of a second later, rolling across the clearing with the flat, disciplined echo of a precision rifle fired from elevation. The ridge. She didn't look up immediately. She moved. Her hand locked onto the front plate carrier of Jacob's vest and hauled him laterally across the mud. His boot dragged uselessly, heel carving a shallow trench through wet earth. He gasped as his injured foot jolted, a raw sound forced between clenched teeth. She pulled him behind the thick base of the oak stump, angling his body into the dead space created by the trunk's girth. Another round snapped through the branches, closer. Leaves disintegrated overhead. "Radio is dead," she said, already keying her handset. Static hissed, back, no carrier wave, no handshake. She toggled frequencies with rapid, economical movements. Nothing but white noise. "They're jamming us." The words were flat, diagnostic, not complaint, assessment. The jamming was deliberate. Broadband denial, likely directional, saturating the valley floor. Clean execution. That meant preparation. They had been in position before the box had been opened. Jacob's chest rose and fell in short pulls. Mud streaked across his jaw where he had fallen earlier. His hands trembled once before he forced them still against his thighs. The dossier pages, now soaked and crumpled against his vest, clung to him like evidence. Another crack. The stump shuddered as a round impacted the outer bark, failing to penetrate but sending a vibration through the wood. Megan angled her body, reducing her profile. She scanned the ridgeline through her optic, sweeping in controlled arcs. No visible muzzle flash, no silhouette. Professionals, likely suppressed platforms, long guns with thermal discipline. 300 meters downslope, the rest of the unit would be exposed along the tree break. She pictured their last known position without turning her head. If the ridge had line of sight on this clearing, it had line of sight on them. The corruption inquiry was over. This was a kinetic engagement against a superior element with elevation advantage and initiative. Jacob swallowed hard. His earlier bravado had evaporated under the first incoming round. Sweat mixed with rain along his temples. His right hand hovered near his thigh as if unsure where to settle. He looked toward the ridge, then down at his ruined foot, then back to her. She reached for his rifle, then stopped. Instead, she shoved it into his hands with firm pressure against the receiver. "Can you shoot?" she asked. His gaze dropped to the weapon. The familiar weight steadied him. He flexed his fingers around the pistol grip. They tightened, whitened at the knuckles. His jaw set, a faint tremor passing through it before he forced control. He shifted, testing the angle of his injured leg. Pain flared across his face, brief, sharp, but he suppressed the sound. "I can shoot," he said, voice hoarse but anchored. A round struck dirt 5 feet to their left, spraying wet soil across Jacob's sleeve. He flinched despite himself, shoulders jerking. Megan chambered a fresh round into her sniper system. The metallic click of the bolt sliding forward was precise, deliberate. She settled into a supported position along the stump's edge, using the natural contour as a rest. Her breathing slowed, diaphragmatic, controlled. She tracked the ridge through magnification, adjusting for elevation and probable wind drift now that the storm front had begun to push through the valley. "Good," she said without looking at him, "because I'm not dying in these mountains for your mistakes." There was no heat in the statement, only fact. Jacob shifted onto his left hip to stabilize his firing position. He braced his back against the stump, angling his rifle toward the ridgeline where the tree cover thinned. His injured foot lay extended, the tourniquet still biting into his thigh. Blood loss had slowed, but his skin had taken on a pallor that contrasted sharply with the mud streaking his face. He inhaled slowly, fighting the tremor in his hands. The fear was there, visible in the tightness around his eyes, in the way his lower lip pressed inward for a second before he steadied it. But beneath it, something else settled in. Acceptance. Another crack split the air. This one closer, shaving bark from the stump inches from Megan's optic. She did not recoil. She adjusted 1/2 mil to the right, scanning for disturbance in the foliage, an unnatural line, a slight shift in shadow. Rain intensified, striking leaves in irregular bursts. The ridge blurred intermittently behind the falling sheet. Visibility would degrade soon. That cut both ways. Jacob's finger found the trigger. He exhaled slowly, aligning his sights toward the suspected firing point. He no longer looked at her for direction. Pinned behind a tree stump, communications severed, elevation against them, and an organized kill team tightening its perimeter. The situation had narrowed to fundamentals: cover, fields of fire, discipline. Megan's eye remained fixed behind the glass. Her breathing matched the rhythm of the rain. She waited for the smallest tell. Night settled over the valley in layers, swallowing the ridgeline first and then the lower slopes where muzzle flashes had stitched through the trees. The rain eased into a steady, cold drizzle that dampened sound and blurred contours. Darkness shifted the geometry of the fight. Megan used it. She repositioned Jacob behind a shallow fold in the earth several meters from the stump, a natural defilade that shielded him from direct line of sight from the ridge. She adjusted his angle herself, pressing a firm hand against his shoulder until his back aligned with the contour. His jaw tightened as his injured foot dragged across wet ground. He did not complain. He simply nodded once when she placed his rifle back into his hands. "Cover the trail," she said quietly. He understood which one. the narrow game path cutting laterally through the trees, the most probable approach for a bounding element attempting to encircle their position. He settled the stock into his shoulder, cheek weld precise despite the tremor in his muscles. Rain traced down the bridge of his nose and dripped from his chin. He wiped nothing away. Megan disappeared into the tree line without another word. She moved low, controlled, distributing weight along the outer edges of her boots to minimize noise. Each step was deliberate, avoiding deadfall, avoiding shallow pools that would ripple under pressure. The gilly strands clung to her in the rain, darkening, tightening against her frame. The ache in her quadriceps from hours of movement registered distantly and then was filed away. The cold worked its way through her gloves, numbing her fingers. She flexed them once around the grip of her rifle and continued. 20 years of warfare lived in her muscle memory. She no longer thought in full sentences, only in angles and probabilities. The mercenaries held elevation, but night stripped them of some of that advantage. Thermal would dominate now. She reached a lateral offset position along the slope, partially shielded by a cluster of boulders and scrub. From there, the ridgeline presented a new profile. She deployed her thermal optic and scanned. Heat signatures bloomed against the cooler background, distinct silhouettes among the trees. One figure stood slightly elevated relative to the others, posture upright, movements economical. He gestured with a gloved hand, directing two smaller signatures to shift right, likely adjusting their envelopment of the team downslope. Squad leader. She observed him for several seconds, confirming pattern and authority. He remained central, rotating his head as he tracked the fight below. The others oriented subtly toward him before moving. Command presence without theatrics. Wind cut through the valley in irregular gusts, pushing rain sideways. Megan adjusted her position by inches, compensating for angle and crosswind. She calculated distance against the thermal scale, confirmed elevation holdover. Her breathing slowed until it barely disturbed the optic. Down the hill, intermittent flashes marked the continued engagement with her unit. The mercenary leader raised his hand again, likely preparing to shift fire. Megan exhaled. The faint cloud of her breath dissolved instantly into the dark. She took up the slack on the trigger. Pressure increased smoothly, without jerk or anticipation. The rifle recoiled into her shoulder with controlled force. Through the optic, she saw the leader's heat signature snap backward and collapse, the bright outline crumpling into the colder earth. For a fraction of a second, the ridgeline froze. Then, it fractured. Two signatures moved abruptly, breaking formation. Another dropped prone, searching for the source of the shot. Muzzle flashes flared in the wrong direction. Undisciplined, searching, Megan cycled the bolt and reacquired. A flanker attempting to reposition along the right tree line paused to communicate. She adjusted half a mil and pressed the trigger again. The figure folded at the knees and vanished from the thermal field. Chaos spread through the remaining signatures. Their spacing widened. One began to withdraw upslope, dragging another by the shoulder. Back in the defilade, Jacob watched through his optic, rain streaking across his field of view. He tracked the ridge as best he could from his limited angle. He saw one mercenary drop without warning, then another. There was no wasted ammunition, no erratic firing pattern. Each shot landed with finality. His breathing slowed as he realized what he was witnessing. Not luck, not desperation, precision. He had called her weak. He had dismissed her qualifications as political necessities, her presence as administrative optics. He remembered the smirk he had worn in briefings, the casual diminutives. Now, through glass and darkness, he watched her dismantle a coordinated assault with measured surgical cadence. He swallowed, throat tight. The rifle in his hands felt heavier than before. Another shot echoed through the valley. A third mercenary collapsed near the ridge crest. The remaining heat signatures scattered, their formation disintegrated. Without their leader, their movement lost cohesion. Jacob lowered his optic for a moment, rain striking his closed eyelids. Heat rose to his face despite the cold. It had nothing to do with the tourniquet biting into his thigh or the shattered bones in his foot. It was something quieter and far more corrosive. He raised the rifle again and covered the trail as instructed. On the slope, Megan held her position, scanning for any attempt to reestablish command. Her face remained still, eyes steady behind the thermal display. She did not allow herself satisfaction, only confirmation. One by one, the ridgeline cooled. Megan reappeared through the thinning darkness with Jacob's arms slung across her shoulders, his weight dragging against her frame. Each step he took was uneven, his injured foot barely grazing the ground. Mud clung to his torn boot, now stiff with dried blood. His breath came in short, controlled pulls, jaw locked against the pain. The rest of the team materialized from defensive positions along the lower slope, faces streaked with rain and grime. Their eyes were wide beneath night vision housings pushed up onto their helmets. They had heard the shots on the ridge. They had seen the firing cease. They looked to Jacob. Even injured, he carried rank in their posture. Their rifles hovered at low ready as they waited for direction. One of the younger operators shifted his weight from heel to toe, swallowing hard, the barrel of his weapon wavering a fraction before steadying. Jacob lifted his head. Rain tracked down the side of his face, cutting through dirt. His lips parted as if to speak. Nothing came at first. His eyes moved to Megan. Something in them had changed. No defiance, no calculation, only recognition. He gave a small shake of his head and lifted a trembling hand from his rifle to gesture toward her. "She has the con," he rasped. The admission cost him. It showed in the tight pull at the corner of his mouth, in the way his fingers curled inward after the gesture, as if bracing for impact that never came. The team's attention shifted instantly. Megan did not acknowledge the transfer. She moved past it. "We're breaking contact," she said, voice low but carrying. Bounding movement, 2-man elements, maintain 5-meter spacing. "We're heading for the ravine east of the slope." She pointed once through the trees. The narrow cut in the terrain would constrict, maneuver, eliminate the enemy's ability to flank with superior numbers. It would also channel movement, compressing fields of fire into predictable arcs, risk balanced against necessity. No one questioned her. They moved. Jacob gritted his teeth as 2 operators took his weight from Megan, one on each side, adjusting his arms across their shoulders. His injured leg hung stiffly. The tourniquet remained in place, darkened fabric pressed into swollen muscle. Each jolt sent a visible tremor through him, but he did not ask to stop. They descended through wet undergrowth, boots slipping against stone and mud. Megan remained rear security, rifle angled upslope, scanning for thermal bloom or sudden movement. Her breathing stayed measured despite the burn building in her lungs. The ravine swallowed them in shadow. Steep earthen walls rose on either side, forcing them into single file before widening slightly along the floor. Water pooled shallowly across the rock bed, reflecting the first hints of gray creeping into the sky. Dawn approached without warmth. They pushed through until the terrain opened toward the designated extraction grid. A clearing cut between the ridgelines, just wide enough for a helicopter landing. The sound reached them before the silhouette. Rotor wash thudded against the valley walls, low and heavy. Heads snapped upward. Relief flashed across young faces, quick, unguarded. One operator let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "There," someone muttered. The aircraft crested the ridge, descending in controlled approach. Matte black. No visible markings, no tail insignia catching the dawn light. The team began to step forward instinctively, weapons lowering a fraction. Megan did not. Her eyes narrowed, tracking the fuselage. No Navy livery, no standard call sign broadcast over their dead coms. The profile matched military architecture, but stripped of identifiers. Clean. Anonymous. "Wave off!" she shouted. The words cracked through the clearing sharper than gunfire. Confusion rippled through the line. One operator hesitated mid-stride, glancing between her and the descending aircraft. Rotor wash whipped debris into spirals around them. She dropped to a knee and shouldered her rifle in one fluid motion. Sight picture aligning not with the cockpit but lower engine intake housing along the side. 3 rapid shots broke in disciplined cadence. The rounds struck metal with dull, violent impacts. A sharp whine cut through the rotor rhythm. The turbine coughed, a shudder rippling through the aircraft's frame. Smoke bled from the intake as the pilot banked hard, nose lifting abruptly. The helicopter aborted its landing, climbing unevenly. It veered over the ridge, trailing a thin smear of smoke before disappearing beyond the tree line. Silence settled in its wake, broken only by the fading chop of damaged blades. The team stared at her. One of the younger SEALs lowered his rifle completely now, eyes wide beneath his helmet. "That was our ride," he shouted, voice cracking. Megan rose slowly. Rain dripped from the brim of her cover. Her expression did not change. She reached into her kit and pulled out the red box. The plastic casing was scuffed, mud-streaked. She threw it at their feet. It landed with a heavy thud, latches rattling. "That was your executioner," she said. The words landed harder than the box. They looked down at it, then back at her, uncertainty shifting into dawning comprehension. No one touched it. "We walk out," she continued. "Tight formation. We control our terrain." Her gaze moved to Jacob. He stood barely upright between the 2 operators supporting him, face pale beneath the grime. His lips pressed thin, pride long stripped away. He met her eyes without flinching. "And we carry him." No one argued. One operator adjusted his grip under Jacob's arm. Another shifted position to take more of the weight. Jacob's jaw clenched once, a brief tremor crossing his face before he steadied. Megan turned toward the tree line, rifle coming back to ready. Behind them, the clearing felt exposed, too open, too easy. Ahead, the mountains waited. 3 days later, they crossed the final tree line at a staggered interval, boots grinding against gravel instead of mud. The Appalachian wilderness released them without ceremony. Ahead, concertina wire and sandbagged fighting positions marked the perimeter of a legitimate National Guard outpost. The American flag moved in a restrained arc above the motor pool, fabric snapping in the cold morning air. Megan walked point. Her uniform was still field-worn, dried mud etched into seams and cuffs, rifle slung but controlled. Her posture remained upright, pace even, eyes scanning until the last possible second. Only when a guardsman stepped forward from behind a barrier, hand raised in recognition, did she allow her shoulders to lower by a fraction. Behind her, the team followed in silence. Jacob lay strapped to a makeshift litter constructed from 2 saplings and ponchos reinforced with 550 cord. His face had thinned over the past 72 hours. Fever glazed his eyes, and a tremor passed intermittently through his jaw despite his effort to suppress it. The tourniquet had long been replaced with proper field dressing, but infection had begun its quiet work. His hands gripped the litter's edge, knuckles pale. He was alive. Inside the perimeter, medics moved quickly, cutting away fabric, checking pupil response, assessing distal pulse beyond the splint that stabilized his shattered foot. Megan stepped aside only when necessary, answering questions in clipped, precise language time of injury. Mechanism of trauma, estimated blood loss, analgesics administered. Her voice never wavered. Hours later, after medical evacuation had taken Jacob deeper into the facility and the rest of the team had been separated for preliminary statements, Megan stood alone in a different uniform. Dress blues. The fabric fell sharply along her frame, pressed to regulation. Gold stripes marked her sleeve commander. Her ribbon rack caught the overhead light, rows of color that spoke without introduction. Her cover rested under her arm as she waited outside the debriefing room. When the door opened, she entered without hesitation. The room was sterile, temperature held low enough to keep minds alert. A long table divided the space. Admirals sat at one side, expressions controlled, hands folded over briefing folders. Beside them, Judge Advocate General officers reviewed documents, tabs marking statutory references, and UCMJ articles. Jacob sat to the right, in a wheelchair. A cast encased his lower leg, white against the dark fabric of borrowed service attire. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers curled slightly inward. He did not look up when she entered. The red box rested in her hands. She approached the table and placed it down with measured care. The plastic made a muted sound against polished wood. Every eye in the room shifted toward it. "Operation Clean Sweep is compromised," she said. No flourish, no raised voice. The statement hung with the weight of evidence already submitted. "The contractor is in custody." A JAG officer exchanged a glance with one of the admirals, pen pausing above paper. The legal machinery had already begun turning. Her words confirmed its direction. "And Commander Thompson," she continued, turning her head slightly toward Jacob, "has agreed to testify in exchange for avoiding a treason charge." The term was not emphasized. It did not need to be. Jacob lifted his gaze at that. His eyes were rimmed red, exhaustion hollowing them. For a moment, his jaw worked without sound. Then he nodded once. Tears gathered despite his effort to hold them back. One slipped free, tracing a line down his cheek before falling onto the fabric of his trousers. He did not wipe it away. Humiliation and relief coexisted in the rigid line of his spine. Megan's expression did not change. No satisfaction. No condemnation. Across the table, an admiral leaned back slightly, fingers interlaced, studying her ribbons, the gold at her sleeve. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of ventilation. The red box sat between them like an exhibit in a courtroom, silent testimony to intent and conspiracy. Megan stepped back once her statement concluded. There was nothing further to add. The facts were sufficient. She picked up her cover, aligned it carefully on her head, brim level. Her movements were unhurried, precise. She turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. Behind her, the proceedings would continue: formal charges, sworn affidavits, evidentiary review. The system would take its course. She did not look back. Justice had been served, not with a gavel, but with a bullet. If you want to follow more stories like this, subscribe to the channel.